Hold on. Okay.
Thank you for attending our class on shade gardening, presented by the UC Master Gardeners of El Dorado County. Our mission is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to our community. Today's class is part one of a two-part series. Our class is being presented by UC Master Gardeners Mary Campbell and Susan Corey McAlpine. Your hosts are Pam Lane and Ruth Haynes. We have a poll posted to get to know you a bit. We'd appreciate you completing that poll now. This presentation will be about an hour and a half long. We appreciate and encourage questions, and we'll do our best to address all of them at the end of the presentation through chat. Since we have quite a number of participants today, we have muted everyone and turned video off except for the presenters. Did you all respond to the poll? If yes, thank you so much. If not, please do that now. Today's class is being recorded and we're streaming on Facebook Live. So if you are joining us on Facebook, welcome. Please like and comment, ask questions, and invite your friends. Okay, for the polling, how did you hear about this class? 39% was on social media, 39% on the Master Gardener e-news, 6% from a friend, 17% from other. And where do you live? 22% live in El Dorado County, 11% in Amador County, and 56% in other Northern California counties. Okay, then, we're ready to start. Here's Mary Campbell.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our presentation of the shade gardening class. We talk about the shade gardening in the foothills. So for a couple of you I noticed are from Southern California. Parts of this may be a little bit more relevant to Northern California and specifically the Sierra Nevada foothills. But by and large, I think you'll find that overall, shade gardening is shade gardening with some variations. The Mediterranean climate that you see on the slide refers to the fact that much of California really is one of the Mediterranean climate zones throughout the world. Many of you may be aware that there are 5 different areas of the world that actually have a Mediterranean climate. This next slide really is just an illustration. This is an illustration of what various shade gardens could look like. What I like to point out here is that there's really not a whole lot of color as such. It's not quite the same thing that you might see in a perennial garden that grows in the sun. But if you look a little more intensely at this, you'll see that there's really a great deal of color, even just in the various greens. So between color and texture and foliage size, I think you'll find that there's a lot of interest in this particular garden. Our discussion today will be predominantly on, as I already mentioned, what's a Mediterranean climate. Then Susan will talk about what shade is. And we're actually going to, at that point, complete part 1, at which point we'll take all of the questions. Ruth will monitor the chat, and we'll bring in the questions to Susan and me from the chat room. Next week's class, we'll go through and look at some of the design considerations and what are some of the plants that you can use for the various conditions of shade. We'll spend a fair amount of time on the dry shade, which is what we deal with here in the foothills, but we'll also talk about a lot of other plants that work well in shade, so that those of you from outside of the foothill area will be able to see that there are a lot of plants that can be used in varying degrees of shade. And the wrap up and questions actually will be at the end of each one of these sessions. So we'll move forward and look at definitions of shade, at which point Susan's going to take over. Susan, Corey McAlpin, you have to come off mute.
Good morning, everybody. Here are some definitions of shade which you might remember from the nursery tags on your plants, or you might have encountered them in your favorite gardening books. Full shade is little or no direct sunlight, dense and lasting all day long. So a plant that's recommended for full shade can do best up against the north side of your house, or perhaps in shade cast by a broad and dense tree. And this is also, full shade plants are also plants that need less than 4 hours of direct sun daily. Partial shade, on the other hand, is defined as shade during part of the day, usually 2 to 6 hours of sun on the plant each day. Also, your plant will need at least 3 hours of shade during the hottest part of the day. Partial sun is sort of the same thing as partial shade, only the flip side, loosely defined as sun during just part of the day. For best results, I find that I go by the partial shade definition. So 2 to 6 hours of daily sun on the plant and 3 hours of shade during the hottest part of the day. Full sun, on the other hand, is what I call the daisy in the desert. So the plant will be capable in this category of growing in sun all day long. So you have to imagine a parking lot landscape plant, something buried in decomposed granite, full sun, and needing a water system to thrive. It's possible to grow full sun plants if you mulch. Let me back up a little bit. It's possible to grow shade plants in full sun if you mulch heavily, provide some shade during the hottest part of the day, and pay attention to the water needs. Next slide, please. Shade density is a little bit more of an exploration of those definitions. Filtered or dappled shade is the shade that comes from a canopy where the sunlight moves across your plant through the canopy throughout the day. So think of a breeze moving tree leaves and branches, where the understory plants are dotted with light in different patterns throughout the course of a day. This is considered a form of partial shade. We'll see an example of that in just a minute. High or open shade, on the other hand, is shade from a high canopy. An example is plants under a tall tree or up against a wall, where the plant receives direct sun only a small portion of the day. Sun and shade on these plants would have distinct and measurable times during a particular season. Plants in higher open shade usually receive their sunlight at a slant. And the last category, dense or deep, is a sort of another definition of full shade. So we'll explore what that looks like in a minute. Next slide, please. Here's filtered or dappled shade. Here's a dogwood letting some sun through branches and leaves all day long and moving its shade over the ground plants when there's a wind and with the movement of the sun. Next slide, please. This is another example of filtered or dappled shade where there's a lower canopy over the ground plants, but still enough movement overhead through the trees so that the plants receive partial sun. Next slide, please. Higher open shade, here's your wall with your shade plants. The plants get bright light off of the wall or directed off the pathway. But it's not considered direct sun. Usually sunlight exposure in this case is of short duration and is too diminished. The sunlight would be too diminished to plant full sun plants in this regard. Next slide, please. This is another example of high shade where there is a forest canopy. The plants derive edge sunlight, so sunlight coming in from the perimeter of their individual trees. And this could be a non-deciduous situation. So the plants would thrive best in the exterior parameter of this. Next slide, please. Here's full shade, and this is really difficult for a lot of reasons. Number one, the shade here is provided by a tree that may or may not have the same moisture needs as the plants underneath. Number two, full shade does not allow the ground to completely dry out. So your understory plants may have a problem with that level of moisture. And number three, your plants underneath will have to survive on very little sun. We'll talk about this in other slides throughout the program. Next slide, please. Let's talk about moisture availability. Two categories here, wet shade versus dry shade. And I was going to say we were going to talk mostly about dry shade in this program until I heard Mary say that we may have some participants in areas that have a different type of shade. So we're going to talk briefly about wet shade also. Wet shade is shade in a bog garden or shade alongside a running creek where there's a lot of aerial moisture. A riparian setting where the water soaks in the adjoining soil and also waters the plant with aerial moisture. Now, aerial moisture is not considered or cannot be considered a substitute for root watering. But when you're thinking about wet shade, think about ferns next to a mountain creek. Dry shade, on the other hand, is the moisture availability most common in the Sierra Nevadas in El Dorado County. Dry shade is like the environment under conifers in our area, mulched with dry duff and home to natives like manzanita. In dry shade, there's always an intense competition for available soil moisture. Next slide, please. Other way. Okay, we need examples of wet versus dry shade. Right there. I want to bring your attention to the dry shade side here, the picture. Notice that you can have a real lush look even in dry shade. We'll talk about a little bit more about specific plants in part 2 to get this sort of look. I wanted to say a couple of things about design, and we'll talk about this later on also. But when designing a shade garden, it's best to use plants with similar moisture needs. For instance, if you have shallow rooted and moisture loving plants that you want to put in your garden, put them together. So you would have a maple tree, shallow roots needing lots of moisture to begin, rhododendrons, and ground covers that multiply by creeping over the ground rather than sinking deep roots. Then you will not, or you should not have problems with your maintaining the proper amount of moisture for all those plants in that garden. Secondly, it's best to plant all your trees and plants in the shade garden at the same time if possible. Because if you have a mature tree and mature tree roots, you will be disturbing them if you plant beneath that tree at a later time. And we know that disturbing mature plant roots, plant doesn't usually, or the tree doesn't usually take kindly to that. Next slide, please. So shade variations, let's talk about seasonal shade variations and also variations in the time of day for shade. Seasonal shade is dependent upon the angle of the sun and sometimes upon the angle, sometimes upon sun and shade through a deciduous canopy. Let's look at seasonal sun first. Next slide, please. So here's the two extremes, winter solstice in December and summer solstice in June. In this illustration of the two extremes, the winter solstice hits the sun at an angle. I'm sorry, the sun hits the roof of the house and the tree at an angle and bypasses the plant almost entirely. So the angle of the sun is lower. The plant in between the house and the tree in the top illustration will have to grow in less sun for a shorter number of hours each day due to late sunrise and early sunset. The summer solstice beats down overhead. The sun beats down overhead on the roof, the plant, and the tree, almost directly overhead, for a longer number of hours each day. An early sunrise and a late sunset means longer days and more sun, so shade plants without a canopy may not thrive. Let's consider, when we look at this, also daily variations of shade. When you're choosing where to plant, note that the afternoon shade, or remember that the afternoon shade will keep your plant cooler on summer days. Why is that? That's because morning shade combines with the nighttime temperatures, lower temperatures, to create a cooler condition in the garden. Whereas when you have a hot sun, hot conditions following that in the same day, that's more of a shock to the plant. So afternoon shade will keep your plant cooler if you have a place like that you're trying to consider. And how do you know when your plant is thriving in a shade garden? Too little sun for a shade plant will result in an elongated stem. Your plant will look spindly. It will have pale colored leaves, and it'll also perhaps not bloom in the same way. Too much sun in the shade garden results in burned leaf edges, sun scald, and withered leaves. The damage will show always on the part of the plant hit by the sun, the brightest sun, for the longest daily time. You know what I've found is when you're considering moisture in the shade garden, if you're trying to figure out when to water, it helps to have what I call a canary plant, as in canary in a coal mine. My canary plant in my shade garden is a large lace cap hydrangea, which gets a little bit too much sun throughout the day. When this plant, which is the most sensitive in the garden, when that plant wilts, I realize that the whole surrounding garden needs water. The hydrangea itself needs temporary shade cloth and deep soaking. Next slide, please.
Bear with me for some reason.
There we go. Okay, so this is an example of poor design in my shade garden. You see the 2 months there. My shadiest garden is situated in the southeast L of our house. The large rhododendron, which you see there on the left, is reliant on the canopy afforded by a red maple on the right by the fence there. The maple does not leaf out fully until the red maple does not leaf out fully until after the rhododendron needs shade. So sometimes the rhodie gets sunburned if the late spring turns hot. The only treatment that I found for this, since I can't move the tree and I can't move the rhododendron, is a fabric sunshade until the red maple leaves out. It's fully leafed out by September, usually August, in the right-hand picture there. That's what it should be all day long. And now I'm going to turn our presentation over to Mary Campbell.
Thank you, Susan, and good morning again, everyone. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about oak and shade garden considerations under oaks. There may be a tree that also is very dependent and needs to work with consideration of plants underneath it that occurs in other than the Sierra foothills. I'm not sure if those of you in Southern California have that as a consideration. But this is something that if any of you ever want to plant under oaks that you should take a look at. There are two things in this picture, and I have a couple more pictures to show you, that indicate that there could be problems for this oak tree. That really seems to be the major consideration that you need to look at whenever you want to plant any plants underneath an oak tree. You don't look at the plants themselves so much as you look at the oak tree and what its needs are. Looking at this particular oak, there are two things that are quite obvious. Number one, the canopy really is very sparse. There's a lot fewer leaves than you would expect to see at this point. The other thing that you really need to take a close look at is that there's some lawn underneath this tree. Both of those conditions are indicative of some problems that you're encountering. Here's another example of where you've got some issues under planting under an oak. Daffodils may or may not be considered in your garden as an annual. You may be doing a lot of digging under this. If you want to divide any of the bulbs, if they're the naturalized ones and you want these to continue to be naturalized, but you need to divide, you're going to be digging into the roots of the oak a fair amount of time. The pathway could also be a real problem because it could be something that you're driving over or walking over continuously, in which case you're creating some compaction on the leaves underneath. That's another thing that you need to look at. And then thirdly, you've got another situation where you've planted a lot of stuff under this oak tree. Again, you want to look at the canopy and the number of leaves that are showing on that. You've got a heavy water need plants, or you have got a couple of water leaf plants under here. Number one, hosta tends to be on the high medium water requirement. So planting it directly under an oak tree in the ground itself under the oak is definitely not recommended. For those of you who are in Northern California, if you've noticed at our Sherwood demonstration garden, in the shade garden, we have several hostas that are planted under the oaks, but they're planted in pots. They are not planted in the soil itself. The other thing is the azalea, which requires a fair amount of water, not as high as the hosta probably because it's more shallow rooted. It still does require a fair amount of water. And then notice there is a lawn. And whenever you put a lawn underneath an oak tree, you're running into problems with giving the oak during the Mediterranean climate summer way too much water. So those are three considerations. Ultimately, the oaks that we showed you will die. Some of the other considerations that you can do to adapt your conditions to better suit your shade plant are shown here, where you want to have spacing, containers, shelters, and then we'll talk about design next week. Some of the shelters that you can put in would be a pergola. This example shows you a lot of things. The pergola is creating more shade using the plants themselves as opposed to using branches or dead branches across, as we've shown in this example. We have the branches fairly open, but then they're covered by the vine that's growing up. You can, in this instance, because you're getting shade, you're getting some sunlight into the flowers themselves or the blossoms, you actually can use something that's perhaps a little bit more sun tolerant than some of the other plants that you would normally use in a full shade garden. So you can get more diverse color in this situation. Another situation where you might want to create some shade would be right outside your house. Without the lath, you wouldn't have any shade on your little terrace here. But underneath the lath, where you've got, you can't see them, but there's a bit of a canopy, a high canopy over the lath, you're getting more shade so that you can grow things like ferns on the wall as you're seeing here. This then becomes a protection, whereas you might have had to deal with full sun reflecting on the house itself. Another situation that you can look at is an arbor, which is another example here where we're able to put some shade across the top of it and continue with the shade underneath it. Don't you love all those begonias? I like it. I don't normally plant annuals in my garden because I'm pretty shaded where I live, but I do love to see them. Oh, we're covering this a lot faster. Maybe we will spend a little time in going into design considerations. I will mention this is the first time we've done this particular class at Zoom, and usually it takes us close to 45 minutes to an hour to do the first part of the presentation, because we spend a fair amount of time back and forth talking with the participants. In this case, because of the way we're doing this class, we're learning, and I trust that you're learning along with us as to how to time the presentation. Some of the things, for example, that you can add in the way of vegetation if you want to create more shade, you can always add trees and shrubs. Some of your trees may be high canopy, some of the trees may be lower, like some of the evergreens, particularly the conifers that have branches a bit lower. You can do the same thing with shrubs. Your shrubs may, your shrubs may be more that are growing along on the ground. Susan's laughing at me for the way I'm not handling my presentation, slide presentation movement correctly. Anyway, your shade could come from the fact that the shrub grows much closer to the ground. So about the only thing you could do under that would be a very low growing ground cover. Or you may have a particular plant that you really want to protect from the direct sun. So you're going to put a shrub on top of that. One thing that I do fairly often here at my place, I like hosta. I like to put a lot of hosta in. So in some cases, I'll use a shrub to give the additional sun exposure protection to a particular hosta. And I put that underneath a shrub. Another thing that you really can do significantly to create more light into your garden, if you have a lot of trees, many of the trees may have limbs that are fairly lower to the ground, and therefore they're creating more of a shade canopy. If you limb up those trees, you're going to get a higher canopy, as Susan showed you on one of the slides where she was showing you the definitions of shade. The higher canopy, of course, is going to allow more filtered sunlight to come in, or more of an angled sun to come in, than you would have gotten if you left those limbs way low to the ground. Does that make sense to everyone? I hope. If you've got questions about that, I'll turn this over to Susan. Excuse me, to Ruth. Because now's a good time to ask some questions. No, wait a minute. I back up. As I said, you're helping us define this class itself. Rather than doing our questions now, let's go into the next portion of our presentation, the early part of next week, and we'll probably repeat some of this because some of these design considerations are really quite important. When you're determining what you want to plant in your shade garden, before you even start, you want to take a look at what's there, consider your sun conditions and when you're getting your sun conditions, so you have a fairly good idea of what your full sun situations are, if there are any, what your partial sun, your partial shade, your full shade areas are. You definitely want to consider part of your layout, your understory trees, like some of the maples, especially the Japanese maples, would be understory. Definitely any dogwoods that you put in are considered an understory. A lot of redbuds are understory as well. And then what you also want to consider are the shrubs. Now, a lot of shrubs can be considered right on the cusp of if it's a tree or is it a shrub. I know I used to grow crepe myrtles, and I'm sure many of you still do. I always thought of crepe myrtles as a tree, but you can also, depending upon how you trim them, you might consider them more of a shrub-like. Other things, for example, a good native that I really like to use is a calycanthus or spice bush. That can be either trimmed in such a way that it becomes more tree-like, or it can remain as a shrub with multiple trunks and multiple branches coming out. Another thing that you want to consider on your layout is what you want to put in groups and what you want to use in masses. When you're planting in groups, a major design consideration is that to make it more interesting, you really want to plant in odd numbers. So if you're doing a group, for example, of coral bells, your minimum number that you want to put under anything when you're putting that plant in is you want to go ahead and have at least 3. For those of you who've had an opportunity to visit the Sherwood demonstration garden, we have planted a fair number of coral bells, or hue coral using the botanical name, in our shade garden. It's in partial sun, but it's grouped in mass in what I would call masses. But again, the number in there is an uneven number to make it more interesting. Some hardscape that you might not want to consider, that you might want to consider. Hardscape is defined as anything that you put in a garden that is not a living plant. So your hardscape may be some boulders. Boulders are a frequent hardscape item that are used in the Sierra foothills. I've got, in my garden, I've got several really sizable boulders. I would never be able to move them. I wouldn't even want to bring in a bulldozer to move them because they're that large, but they create a focal point for me. So I really enjoy having the boulders in my shade garden. Some other hardscapes could be things like a gate that you want to have into a particular portion of your garden. If you have a lot of places, let me backtrack for just a moment. A lot of shade area might be created as a pathway along one side of your house, particularly if you have a neighboring house relatively close to you, or if you're living in a city and you have a lot of your shade areas are created because you have a lot of houses surrounding your garden. You might have a fair amount of shade. Your gate may lead you into that portion of your garden, and it can become then considered a separate room. But the hardscape item would be your gate. You can have garden ornaments. If you have a pond, for example, in your garden, you may have a standing great blue heron, not a living great blue heron, but a sculptured great blue heron. That would be considered hardscape. Pathways, bridges, boardwalks, all of the shelters that I showed you, those are all examples of hardscape. So anything that is not a living plant really is considered in the hardscape area. So that really expands the ability in your shade garden of bringing in points of interest, because think of hardscape as items that can bring you points of interest. Don't have to. I mean, they can be just a hardscape could be the pathway that you have between two garden beds. But in order to make each of the garden beds more interesting, and you want that specifically, I think that's a particular point that you want to see, especially in shade gardens. You don't want it to be straight. You don't want the garden beds to be straight. You want the garden beds to be more on a either a circular or even an uneven bed. What's the word I'm trying to find? Edge of the bed. Hardscape in that instance might be smaller rocks that you use to define where the edge of that particular bed falls. Another hardscape item that you could use in the design of a pathway would be bricks. And there are several different ways that you can put bricks in to define the edge of your garden bed. They can be on an angle, or they could be flat. They could be on the long side so that the rectangular side is up. Another way you can define your garden bed would be in small stakes or small sticks. Another example, if you have the good fortune of having a lot of willow twigs that you have in your garden, for example, you could use the willow twigs and put them along the edge of your garden, and then weave some of the willow limbs that are more pliable and smaller through the upright willow twigs along the edge of that pathway. Those are all some examples of hardscape, and they're by no means limited to the ones that I've given you. Another area that you want to use in your design consideration is what colors do you want to have in your garden. A good example here is a moonlight garden. Moonlight gardens are wonderful if you don't have a whole lot of dense canopy shade. So you want to be able to get some light in 24 hours if there's a good full moon or a partial moon that's pretty bright. You can bring in the moonlight garden by putting plants in that are going to have light colored flowers, usually white or ecru, or some other other shades of beige that are going to be very light in color, that light up quite a bit during the early or late afternoon and early evening hours. Textures are another excellent example of what you can do to make your shade garden more interesting without even having to worry too much about bringing a lot of color variation. I really like texture being brought into a garden because I think it makes it more interesting. Think of using ferns and hosta and ligularia, for instance. All three of those have different, another one is a hellebore. Those four plants all have different textures to them that can create interest in the shade garden. But if you combine those textures of the four plants that I brought into the colors that you can get in those plants, you can really get some interesting combinations. With the hellebores, you have differing plant flowers in the early part of the year, depending upon which of the hellebores you put in. Hellebores bloom in as early as January, February, March, April. And they have differing colors on their blossoms. They can also have some variations in their texture when compared to something like a hosta. If you look at hosta, there is virtually no end to the variations that you can get in the colors, because hostas can be a deep blue-green. They can be a very light, what I would call almost a lime green, and then they can be anywhere in between. They can be a lime green with white edges. They can be a bluer green with white edges on them. There's a lot of color variation that you can get in a hosta simply by looking at the combinations of white and green. So the common thought or the common myth, I think, about shade gardens is that they are colorless. Shade gardens are anything but colorless, but you really do have to stop and think how you want to bring in that additional color and how you're going to do it through other than just color, how you're going to make your garden really interesting. So some of the three conditions that I've given you here that you can bring in to make your garden more interesting are your hardscape, your colors, and your textures. The other thing that you want to look at, and Susan talked a lot about what changing conditions you encounter, but you really want to bring that into consideration as you look at your designs. If you're going to get the way we do, for example, in the shade garden at the Sherwood Demonstration Garden, late afternoon sun in a portion of your garden, you're going to want to put the plants in there that are going to be able to handle that intense sun. Not all true shade garden plants are going to be able to handle that type of sun, but some of them can. So those are considerations you need to look at. When you look at the individual plant, you really need to determine, can they take any sun? How much sun can they take? Do you want to actually push out a little bit on the sun requirements? As far as I'm concerned, when you're doing garden design or actually continuing changing your garden, experimentation is a good word to use. There is nothing set in concrete as far as I'm concerned when it comes to what you can put in your garden. There are so many variations that can occur, and they are going to change from one garden to the other. You've got microclimates, which we haven't really even touched on. And of course, you've got your changing conditions as they occur because of season changes. You've got changing conditions because of daylight. You've got moisture changes that may occur, which is one thing that you run into very significantly in the foothills here up in the Sierra Nevadas, because we truly are a Mediterranean climate. In the Mediterranean climates, as we've mentioned before, you have a wet winter and a dry summer. In our foothills this year, and where I live and where most of us live in El Dorado County, we literally got zero moisture throughout much of the summer months. I went all through the entire month of October before I saw any rain, and that just occurred this weekend. So I waited until the 6th of November before I even saw anything leaking out of the sky to come and help me with the moisture going to my plants. All of those are things that you need to consider when you're looking at design. Next week, when we go a little bit more detailed on design, we'll take a look. I'll give you some examples of hardscape, some of the examples of color and texture to help a little bit more on this definition, but consider this kind of a teaser for next week's presentation. So at this point, I'll go back and turn this over to Ruth. Take it away, Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Here's a question. I've been looking for a ground cover I can use in place of sod in partial shade. Must take foot traffic and child play. Any suggestions?
Ooh. That's a toughie. There are ground covers that will take some traffic. The main thing that you want to consider when planting your ground covers is root compaction, soil compaction that you're going to get because you're going to take traffic on it. Some of my favorite ground covers probably would not take that traffic very well. Susan, what would you recommend? I know
The only one that I have personal experience with that takes foot traffic is woolly thyme, and that's a full sun plant.
So that might work where you're getting afternoon sun.
Maybe, yeah. In my shade garden, I've had the best experience with foot traffic. So I have violets that have kind of taken over my ajuga and my Serbian bellflower, my campanula, which I had planted. So the violets crept in there, and they're almost invasive. They're almost invasive. They tend to tolerate shade and sun. And I've walked over them a lot and they bounce back. So, but yeah, that's pretty tough. You might want to put kind of either a small path or some stepping stones. You know, it's tough with kids, but you know, that's a toughie.
Well, some of the things that could, depending upon how much traffic it gets, would be some of the liriope that gets some variation in its leaves and can in some circumstances be used as a lawn alternative. There are some liriopes that will do better, and mondo grass that will do better in shadier conditions than full sun. Carex is another one. That's a sedge, is its more common name, but some of the carex are a little, there's more room between each of the plants, so it would have be more tolerant of traffic. We can give you some more examples next week, talk in more detail about some of the plants. Give us an opportunity to look into that. There are so many different considerations that come in and what kind of traffic you're getting. You could get traffic from children, you can have traffic from dogs, you can have traffic from other animals. If deer frequent your property as they do mine, you have to look at two things there. You have to look at, will they take the traffic? Will the sun excuse me, will the plant take the traffic? And also, will it take the deer without killing the plant? So those would be considerations. We'll have more examples next week for you.
We will also have a week to do some research on that question.
Thank you, Susan. I wasn't going to make that obvious, but that's exactly what we'll do. Ruth, next question.
Yeah, another question is, what does limb up a tree mean? You know, limb up trees?
Good question. Limbing up a tree, let's take a look at a tree that you've got. Let's say you've got a cedar tree, which is a fairly common tree that we see here in the foothills. Cedar trees tend to have branches that are a little lower to the ground than you would like. Limbing up is just what it sounds like, where you're taking the lower limbs of a plant, of a tree particularly, and you're cutting them off. When you do that, I just remind everybody that we want to use that, leave that branch collar on and not to trim that up so that you're pressing right up against the trunk of the tree. You've got a branch collar. And I know Pam is very knowledgeable about tree trimming. She may be able to give you a better definition if she would jump onto this and explain a branch collar.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me, Mary?
Yes, we can hear you. You have a little bit of an echo, but we can hear you.
Okay, well, the branch collar is literally a ring that you can see next to the tree where you're going to try to cut the branch off. So as you're limbing up the tree, there's a section that on the branch next to where you're going to cut up against the tree that is maybe bigger than the rest of the branch. And you don't want to cut into that branch collar, otherwise the tree will not be able to heal itself. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent example. Thank you, Pam.
You're welcome.
Go ahead.
Another question is, I have used rocks under my oaks to prevent weeds, but have left an area under the canopy with only wood chips and room for the leaf to drop. My oak trees do look sad. Do you suggest I remove more of the rock and increase the open area under the trees?
Susan, you want to answer that one?
I can try. We have oaks on our property that have seeded from, we have little oaks seeded from big oaks. And I usually leave them strictly alone. I would think that putting rocks under an oak tree in your garden would be a good idea. It reminds you not to walk under it, hopefully, which, as Mary explained, compacts the roots. And then leaving the drip line, which is the perimeter of the branches, the edges of the branches. The drip line is where the young roots are on any plant. So you look at the plant, you look at the longest branches, and at the tips, going straight down from the tips to the ground is drip line, and that's where the small roots form and they grow outward into the ground. So that's the area you do want to keep free to absorb rain, and in the case of an oak, that's probably the only water that it should be absorbing. I've tried to transplant oak seedlings, and I've tried to water oak seedlings, leaving them in place where they volunteer, and they don't like any of that.
They don't like the water. Another thing that you should double check that you are not doing, and oaks are particularly intolerant of this, do not mulch up against the tree trunk. You need to leave an area around the trunk of the tree completely open. And preferably, as Susan mentioned, you really don't want to put anything underneath that canopy, that if you can avoid it. Rocks don't create as much of a moisture basin underneath as a bark mulch, for example, would. Look at what you see growing or not growing. If you drive anywhere in the foothills and see the native oaks growing, like the California oaks, and see what's growing under there, there's very little that grows underneath a true oak tree. If you leave it to grow in its natural conditions and don't add anything to it, you'll see that very little grows underneath it. It's predominantly, you can even usually see some of the roots coming up, some of the bigger roots that are coming up out of the soil in parts of the area underneath that canopy. So I would recommend definitely not having any mulch. Make sure if you do have rocks that you're not getting so many rocks in there that you're creating an area underneath those rocks that's going to stay moist in the summer, particularly in the summer months. Does that help? I hope.
Yeah, I think it will. Another question. I would love to get a list of the plants Mary is discussing. Seeing pictures of them could also be helpful.
Oh, good. You're leading us right into the second part of this class. One of the things that we're going to be doing next week is going through a lot of the plants, giving you pictures of them, giving you more description of them. We'll talk pretty in depth about each of the individual plants. And some of them will mention that maybe they won't do very well in the foothills, but you might want to consider them for areas outside of the foothills and vice versa. We do have some plants that we've isolated that we'll talk about that are particularly suited for dry shade, because the Mediterranean climate really creates the dry shade conditions that we're dealing with.
Okay,
Oh.
Thanks. Another question is, my front yard faces east with the southern exposure. There are several oaks, then a gap of 20 feet before getting to my home. So I want to create shade there. I was thinking of using a red bud, but Susan's examples of how late in the spring the tree leaves out is causing it rethink. Any suggestions?
Go ahead, Susan. I can see you're going to say
No,
something.
you go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, the first consideration I've got is that we're in California and we now have to consider fire and fire prevention. Most every insurance company that insures your home and our fire prevention classes will teach you not to plant anything near your house. Really, 30 feet is a good perimeter for planting nothing near your house. So I would suggest if you're going to put anything in there using containers, not planting anything. I certainly would not put an understory tree under there. And you're right, redbuds tend to leaf out a bit later. Dogwoods, of course, leaf out after they've bloomed, so you wouldn't want that. So I would be very, very hesitant to put in an understory tree.
That's a really good point. A lot of people are having their fire insurance inspected, and that's one of the things that an insurance inspector will look at is the bare space between the nearest vegetation and the edge of your house. It has to be defensible space.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Another thought on the choice of trees for a dry area, if you want to plant them to provide shade, is to look at what grows naturally. Plant that type of tree. An example would be the redbud, which can exist in very dry conditions naturally, and can also be pruned as a shrub so that you can throw a dense amount of shade, well, not a dense, but a kind of a light amount of shade in an area where you want to plant an understory. But again, you have to be careful of roots. So when you put any kind of tree in, I would be careful when you plant underneath it that you don't disturb the roots.
And that's why I said when we were talking about oaks back in looking at some of the problems of growing under oaks, they're very sensitive. Not only are they sensitive to too much moisture, especially in the summer months, but they're also very sensitive, like many trees are, of having their roots disturbed after they've started growing. That's why I've gotten to the point, I've added, I don't know how many containers in my garden, whereas I used to plant right into the ground. I've learned, not only through the education that I've gotten as a result of the Master Gardener program, but I've learned through experimentation that I don't want to put a lot of plants into the roots underneath some of the shade trees that I have.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I have 2 sequoia trees in my backyard. I put DG around the first one. Will it hurt the root system?
Where I would ask where that person lives would be the first question that I would need to know. I would definitely want to move the DG out closer to the edge of the canopy.
She lives in Camino.
Pam, you're really more of a tree person than I think I am, and particularly as it applies to a sequoia. What would you think about moving that DG out a bit?
I would definitely recommend to move it out.
You have to unmute yourself, Pam. You're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
No, you're still muted.
It says I'm not.
Now you are not muted. Go ahead. Now,
Okay. I was going to say, I would definitely move it out. I don't, I've never recommended to put something that heavy on top of a root system.
even though you can put DG down and actually use it, for example, as a pathway or use it as mulch in some gardens, because it is permeable, but it also creates fairly dense mulch, and you're going to get more moisture. The ground underneath is going to stay moister than it would under some of the organic mulches, for example. Anything else you add, Pam?
No, I agree. I agree with you. I wouldn't use it underneath the tree.
If you want to see what a good example of use of decomposed granite is in a garden, visit our Sherwood demonstration garden on one of our open garden mornings, and you'll see in our succulent garden that the mulch in it is all decomposed granite. And just then think about what a succulent garden really is. It's truly a low water use garden. So it would make sense to use decomposed granite in a situation like that. Any more
Okay, thank you.
questions? Another question?
Yes. Can the instructors review shade types versus seasonal types of trees? My garden seems to vary quite a bit.
Susan?
I'm sorry, Ruth, can you say that again? I didn't catch all of it.
Can the instructors review shade types versus seasonal variation?
Shade types versus seasonal variation. Shade types, we reviewed full shade, which is from a dense overhanging tree, or in any situation where the light doesn't get to the ground. It's very hard to grow plants in full shade, I think, except for some, and we'll go through those in part 2. Partial shade defined as defined as shade during part of the day, or filtered or dappled shade, as in light coming through a moving tree, like a dogwood that doesn't have a real dense canopy. And then full sun is a situation where you had no shade at all. And I drew the analogy to a parking lot landscape plant, which is like you have to have a really, really durable plant to survive in those conditions. Let's see, seasonal variation is just to be aware of, and this takes a little bit of observation, that sometimes it has to become a priority, I guess, to I don't want to sound like the police, but if you can observe your garden in different seasons and observe the seasonal variation in the sunlight, which is usually a matter of angle of sun. So for instance, in summertime, you have hot sun coming straight down on a plant, and you will need to provide some kind of a structure like those that Mary suggested, or some sort of a overhanging tree to protect your shade garden, as opposed to the slant of the sun at a more acute angle during the winter time. And I've got to tell you guys, I'm a real fan of putting stuff in pots, especially plants that I really treasure. When I buy them from a nursery, usually I've waited a while to try to find them. I put them in a big pot, and I move that pot around in throughout the summer to find the place that it seems to thrive. And I observe it carefully for elongated stems, pale leaves, the things that I talked about when we were talking about the signs that your shade plant is not doing well. A pot is wonderful because then you can move it around. And I know that Sunset Western Garden Book has a whole section on shrubs and plants that do well and trees, actually, even Japanese maples do very well in pots, and you can move them around seasonally. So does that kind of answer the question? A quick review.
Yes, you get, she chatted back. So a better explanation might be that the amount of shade is varying by the season. So it can be full shade in the winter, but have dapples during the summer. So if I have both, what drives my plant choices?
Probably the summer, because that would have the most, I think, extreme effect on your shade plant.
That's what I would look at, Susan, would be the sun it's going to receive during the high sun period, which would be your summer months. If you look back at that illustration that was in the early part of the presentation that Susan used to show the seasonal variations, think about your plants in a condition like that, because that will really help you understand. The other thing that Susan said that I can't agree with more is the fact that and this is particularly applicable when you're adding to your garden after you've done all the design and initial planting, is the fact that she's putting things in containers and moving them around. To me, gardening there's nothing really cut and dried in gardening, because every one of us have different situations that change with the seasons and will change based on microclimates particularly. So having the ability to move your plants without having to dig them up out of the ground to see where they're going to work best is an excellent way to handle. Or you're going to spend all of your time planting and then digging up and planting and digging up. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the more you do that, the more you're disturbing not only the soil and bringing up any weed seeds that you'd rather not, but you're also potentially doing some damage to the roots of the plant. Ruth?
Yeah, thank you. There are no more questions. Do you have any closing remarks, Mary and Susan?
Just the thing that I would like to add at this point is that, and I've said it several times already, but one of the things that we're going to be doing this winter at the Sherwood Demonstration Garden on our two Saturdays that were open in the morning, one of the things we'll do is to have several of us actually in the shade garden at the Sherwood Demonstration Garden, being prepared there to give you some very concrete examples of what we talk about in this class. One of the things we can show you very clearly are what the planting under oak situation looks like and how we've worked around that problem. So I encourage you, the first 2 Saturdays of every month are open at the Sherwood Demonstration Garden. They're open from 9 to noon. And I know for a fact that Susan and I will be there on the Saturday that's going to have us stationed in the shade garden. And I'm sure some of the other helpers in the shade garden will also be there. So,
The only thing that, the only thing that I would add is to not be afraid to experiment. And I guess the flip side of that is to not get too attached to the outcomes. I've had some disastrous experiences with too much moisture on plants, shade plants that don't want it. And we could kind of go on and on. I'm sort of the master gardener who's, I have a lot of information, but I also have a lot of disasters. So as you saw in that slide on the design of the shade garden, and some of those things can be fixed and some of them can't. But I think the whole thing about gardening is to regard it as an experiment and a joyful use of your time. You're right, Cecilia. She says disasters are good lessons.
Yeah, well, they're very good lessons. You're right. Susan and I will do our homework and come up with good ground covers. And anything that we see in your questions that you've already submitted, we'll look into that and see if we can expand on that, if there's anything that we haven't covered that we should have covered in that. And next week, then we'll go over more detail on design considerations, and particularly have some examples of some of those. And then we'll go into the plants themselves that do well in types of shade. And we will again look at dry shade. So with that, if I can get my slide to advance, there it is. Ruth, are you talking about the survey, or is Tracy going to jump back in at this point?
Oh, I will.
Okay.
I'd like to thank you for attending our first presentation on shade gardening. Remember, the next presentation is next Saturday at 9 o'clock. And please complete the evaluation that will be sent to you. And you can email your questions. Email your questions in. And
Sorry, Ruth, I don't mean to interrupt. There was one more question about spindly plants.
Yes, yeah. Could you answer that? Yeah, I just got that.
Sure. If your shade plant does not get enough sun, it's in the shade too much, they are reaching, right, Cecilia's got it. They are reaching for the sun. So they put a lot of growth into a long stem, smaller leaves, paler color, and sometimes it can affect the bloom. So, and the short answer is they don't get enough sun. They need a little bit more sun.
Okay, thank you. Cecilia was also wondering what background I had. That was from, it's not live, I wish it was. That's from Costa Rica. We were there about 17 years ago when my daughter was going to school there. So that's from Costa Rica. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you next week.
Thank you,
everyone.